So as I said when I started, the agenda for reporting, the tips and tricks is a pretty broad topic. We've had specific webinars in the past on just things like what date to use. So this one I took a different approach and focused more on how do I help people understand how to build a report, really the basics of that, and then going through some recommendations for how to keep the reports organized and keep them clean, especially if you're an organization that's had the system for 3, 4, 5, 10, 8 years. You'll see the number of reports kind of continually increase over time, and it's rare that they decrease because people don't do like a cleanup effort type thing. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about, how best to find stuff that's really good and really current. Okay. So from a report development perspective, reports are a very important part of OpenAir. While you were going through deployment of your system, I'm sure you spent much time understanding like how the system works and how data puts in and what controls you can have about who can do what and who can see what. But a big majority of what people use OpenAir for is not only tracking the data, but understanding the data coming back out. So things like your metrics, your project managers are doing project progress reporting and forecasting. You're understanding your resource and staffing needs and margin reporting. So there's a lot of different ways to look at the data, and that's why reporting is kind of a huge topic. We actually have a report workshop that we can deliver for. It takes a day and a half to get through material, so you can imagine in a 30-minute webinar, I'm going to cut this pretty short. But one of the things that I highlight when people start working with developing a report is really taking the time. Don't just jump in and start picking things in OpenAir. Pull out a spreadsheet and lay out what do you want the report to look like, or use your spreadsheet reports that you used to use before you went to OpenAir to kind of design out your report. So does your report need to subtotal by anything? What are the different ways that you need to subtotal? Subtotaling a lot of times gives you direction that you have to add custom fields like drop-downs and pick lists and stuff in order to group the information in certain ways. And maybe those are missing in your system, so now you have to augment that in the configuration. The columns of information that you need, so if you bring project in, is that enough intelligence for you to understand what you're looking at, or do you also need the customer or the project manager along with that to help interpret the information? Do you want to put a dashboard on the report, or do you want the report to drive a dashboard? As many of you who I worked with know, I'm very big on dashboards. I like the graphical view of things, but there is a consideration when you're building a report on what will make sense to show on a graph. What kind of time periods are you looking at? Are you looking at historical? Are you looking at future? Do you have to adjust what the definition of a month is because your month is not a standard Hallmark calendar month? So those are all things that, as part of your configuration of OpenAir, things called custom time ranges don't impact any functionality except report. So you sort of want to get ahead of that and know what your time periods are. Do you need to drill down? So, and what I mean by that, it's not drill through. That can be easily confused. So running a report and then you get a hyperlink for the project so you can jump into the project. That's not what I mean. What I mean by this is it enough to see utilization at just the department level? Do you want to see who's contributing to the utilization and what projects are they working on? And those are the subtotals, so it kind of goes hand in hand with the subtotals and the drill down activity for your report design out. And with the quick view feature, if people aren't familiar with the quick view feature, if you hover over a project, even if it's in a report, the quick view will come up and give you a hyperlink to basically jump into that project if you want to. So it does give you some capability to be able to just let it sit there and filter, and then a quick view will come up depending on your timing that you have set up in the system. And then finally, is this, do you have to consider data restriction? So not only what people can natively see with their filter sets, but does the report need to take control of the data view? And there's a filter option that I'll show you in a couple of slides here. Now, that's all well and good, so you design it out and you get the perfect report, but you also have to keep in mind who is your audience. So if you add too much information into a report, that may not work for an executive. Executive wants summary, quick, at-a-glance type information. Project managers need more data drilling metrics and the analytic fields to understand what has to move where based on tasks and users and stuff like that. So you actually may end up developing a report and then making different versions of it based on who the audience is. And the other thing to keep in mind is in some of your configurations, there's a lockdown on who can make changes to a report. That might be for security concerns, it might be for report maintenance concerns. But if you do have that lockdown in place, which means people can't edit reports, they can only run them, you will be increasing the number of reports you have to build, because you also have to build a last week and a this week and a next week, depending on the type of report. So you're having to build out the time period versions of that report as well. I'm not saying that that's a bad practice. It's certainly a good practice if you have concerns about data security and being able to make sure that people can only look at the data they're supposed to be looking at if the filter sets are not a robust enough control. Just be aware that you have to then maintain those versions going forward. So I took a couple of these design elements, which as you're listening to this, you're probably saying, yes, of course, that makes sense. How could you build something just from scratch out of the blue? But there's some specific items that I've run into when I'm building reports, even myself, having worked with the tool for 15 years, that I catch myself doing, and I thought I would pass on those tips to the folks here on the phone so that you can kind of get a better understanding of what to watch out for as you're designing your reports. And the first one I want to talk about is subtotals. Okay, so subtotals are something that is pretty easy to get crazy with, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to relate things together like they're in an Excel document. And we all know Excel is easy to add that filter and then filter it down, and then you can find what you need to find. So a good example is this on the screen here, where I want information down to the task level. So I've built a cross-tabbed report or a summary report that is clients, subtotaled by projects, subtotaled by tasks. And all I'm looking for is hours by task with information about what project it is and what client it is. And this is a completely valid report. However, when you run it, the information comes all indented, of course, based on the subtotals. So the readability is a bit of a challenge. And as you add more information to this report, depending on what you're reporting on, it can be quite cumbersome to try and figure out how to read this report if your end goal is actually to get time at the task level. A subtotal report is good for that drill down type thing. So if you know your end goal is ultimately to get hours at the client level, this is a perfect report. But if your end goal is to get hours at the task level, I would suggest actually just creating a single row for the task and removing those subtotals by just adding fields that are available as detail fields, they're called, on the task. So now you have a very flat report that says, here's the task, and by the way, here's the project and the client it's on, and then the hours that you wanted for that report. So now you're back to that spreadsheet type thing that if you wanted to do any filtering or sorting, you could do that very quickly without having to worry about the relationships between the things. So that's one thing I find that sometimes subtotals are our enemy instead of our friend, and look to flatten things out if you can to make it more readable. The other tip that I like to highlight is when you add detail fields to a report, and detail fields are those descriptor fields that don't really have any kind of date index. They're just sort of pieces of information currently against objects like tasks or projects or users or clients and so forth. And when you add those, the order that they show up underneath the main object is the order they show up on the screen. However, if you have multiple objects, like here I have task and user, the order of the subtotal drives the order of the detail fields. And by the way, that also drives the relationship of the data. So if you had wanted to have department over to the left-hand side versus the right-hand side, you can simply switch things around. So now the department is on the left-hand side, However, you're also flipping the report to be a user by task report versus a task by user report. But if you wanted department in the front, that may have been what you wanted all along. So just be aware that the order of the subtotals actually drives not only the order of the groupings of data, but also the order of the detail fields. Another one is the graphics. So I've got a few examples here, and the graphs and dashboards, I find it kind of difficult to kind of explain put my finger on exactly what to tell people, and they're like, well, how come I can't get this? I want a report that goes this and this and this, and a graph that goes like that. And so I sort of boiled it down to the graphical or dashboard views in OpenAir really are a two-dimensional object, and that's pretty obvious when you look at it because it's got an X and a Y axis. But we all have had experience probably with Excel, and Microsoft Excel actually allows you to do lots of other things with the graph, like put a trending line on and being able to have stacks with a balance bar, and so you can get really complex with the reports. But OpenAir keeps it two-dimensional, X and Y axis, with some ways to group multiple values within those two axes. And I've broken it down into three approaches that I think help explain, or I hope help explain, how the graphs versus the report structure can pan out. Okay. So my first example is when you're thinking of two, look at your report and think in terms of what two things do I want from this report. So if I have a report where I want information across a time period, one of the simplest graphs allows you to grab the first row subtotal values, and then this is a line graph. So the line graph allows you to go across multiple time periods, but I have one reporting value. So that's where the two comes from. One subtotal, one reporting value, okay? And then the time periods are driven by the type of report that I picked, which is a line graph here. And so if I open this report up behind the scenes here, you'll see the first subtotal row is something called record type. And that is driving the three elements here on the graph. And then the single reporting value is called total billing, and that's driving what each of the line values are. That's the one reporting value. So one row, one reporting value, and then it goes across the time frame. Okay. A gotcha that happens all the time when you're first starting to deal with graphs is you forget to hide that company row. So if you're starting with a company summary report, if you forget to hide that company row, that is your first row. So you don't get 3 lines in that case, you get 1. And it's hopefully exciting, but what you're really wanting is the 3 breakdown. So just remember, if you're using a company summary report as your base, click that checkbox to hide the company row or close that little eye icon. So those of you who are familiar with the new reporting interface, if you close that little eye, the winky eye thing, that will hide the company row. So right here, this little eye thing, if you click on it, it hides it. Okay. Now the second example, oops, going the wrong direction. The second example of a graph and the two-dimensional support is you're still looking at the first subtotal row, so you're going to see a pattern here, the first subtotal row, and one reporting value. Oops, is that? Oh, sorry. 2 reporting values across. Did I have this right? No, I have this in the wrong report here. Okay, great. So my slides got a little messed up. So it's 2 reporting values. Nothing like editing it real time. 1 time period. Even practice this first. So the 2 dimensions are one reporting subtotal and 2 reporting values, but you're picking 1 time period. So now that's the 2 dimensions. It's 1 row with 2 reporting values, so that your reporting value is in 1 dimension, but you can only do 1 time period. You can't do multiple time periods because that's a 3rd dimension. So if I do 1 row, 2 reporting values, and multiple dimensions, that's 3 things I have to consider. So something has to be 1, and this 1 time period solves that problem. So here I've got a graph where I'm comparing plan versus actual from bookings and timesheets, and by doing that, I'm able to pull it for one time period. So I've got one time period, an hours column and a booked hours column by user. So my users are my axes, and then my bars are the hours here. So I've got one time period but two reporting values, and that will support that because that's your two dimensions. Okay. Now the third example, which I also have to stop and edit, so you're going to get to see what it is. Okay. One row, one subtotal, one row. Yeah, okay. So on this one, it's slightly different. It's still one row subtotal, one reporting value, and you're wanting to go across multiple periods. But in this situation, your one subtotal row is actually giving you all of the multiple periods in one entry. So here I've got a report that this just shows you 2012 and 2013, but it goes on to 2018. And each of the years are represented for each of the row subtotals, but it's a single reporting value. So again, it's slightly different because it's not that line graph version that I showed you before. It's more of a bar graph, but you can see how it groups it for each of the rows. So the key really is on a graph is the subtotal is your first dimension, and then it's either a single time period with multiple values or a single value across multiple time periods. And that's the sort of give and take of the graphical views with reports to get the graphs that you want. Okay. Now, the last configuration tip as far as design is concerned is the data view controls. So some of you may already be aware of this, but there's actually a configuration on the report called report filter set. And what that allows you to do is to be able to have the report take control of the data view. So it doesn't matter what the end user can see, if they're an administrator even, it doesn't matter because the report is in control. And in that case, I find that it's easy to set up report-only filter sets, like a self-view filter set or a My Projects filter set or a My Team filter set, my direct reports filter set. And the filter set itself has a very simple configuration. The self-view example is I just filter it for myself, and that way whoever runs this report, it only filters for themselves, so they only see data related to them. And the same thing for the My Projects, access to own projects. So the filter sets are very, very, they're kept very simple, and that's on purpose because we want to have a very clean understanding of how that report's going to take control of the system. Okay. And then what you do is you create that one report, you put the report filter set control in place, and then you share it with everyone. And when you share it with everyone, whoever runs it, it pays attention to the filter set of the report in relation to the person who's running it. So that's a nice, easy way to make things scalable as far as building reports and making them like a self-service report or a project management report that you want multiple people to use. Now, it's all well and good to write reports, but reports tend to be owned by different teams. You got your finance folks, your HR folks, your individuals that care about their self-service stuff, the department heads that care about their team performance, project managers that care about projects. And they all can use the same reports, but they're all looking at data a little bit differently. So what ends up happening is they want their version of it. Finance cares more about margin and cost and billing, and project managers care more about timelines and plan versus actual, and department heads care more about utilization. So those reports all need to have their own information on it so they're useful for the individual. So you don't have like a one-size-fits-all type report. And in that case, to make it clear on who sort of owns that report, naming conventions are useful, and folders to kind of organize things are useful. So using a simple prefix like fin for finance and PM for project managers and self for self-service, those will all be very helpful to know, hey, this is a finance-based report, so it's probably going to have information about cost and billing and revenue, and do I care about that? And then putting those into folders, now you have a way that people can quickly say, I'm going to look in the finance folder. Hey, go look in the finance folder for that, backlog by month report. And they'll have access to a standard set of reports that way if you order it by folder, organize it by folder. Okay. And the nice thing about the folders then is that you can use assignment groups to share the whole folder with types of people. So you can have Like in this example, it's even broken down by geography, but you could have a finance assignment team and a PM assignment team and a management assignment team, and you just decide which of those teams need to have access to that folder, and you share the whole folder. So you don't have to go report by report by report to share the reports with people. You can just share the whole folder, and let the role of the person control their access to the information. Because remember, roles can control whether people can see cost, and if they can't see cost, they can't see margin. So if they try to run a finance report with margin on it, they won't see anything because they don't have permissions to run it. So there's some kind of efficiencies here, keeping the roles in sync with what you want the report to focus on. Okay. And some standard reports, many of you have reports now. There's some really simple reports that you can actually get from NetSuite now for OpenAir, a standard set of reports. If you put a ticket into support, they can give you some standard time and expense and project-based reports that they've included now to make things sort of a starter set. But these are some of the reports that I find being created over and over again when I work with customers. Things like margin and profitability, your plan of hours versus your budget versus your bookings versus your actual, doing ETC, EAC type reporting for projects. Those are all, there are a lot of different hours types versions. You're watching your budget as far as what you've got left and what you're forecasting to burn. And then on the finance side, a lot of it is that finance piece, WIP and deferred revenue, billing versus revenue, cost by cost center, average bill rate. Those are all values that the finance team can get, and those are all very much project and account-based reports. From a resource perspective, now we're focused things on utilization, and not only just what's happened, but what will happen. So forecasted utilization, historical utilization broken down by different categories. What are the hours of people being available? Do I need to staff, hire more staff? What are the vacation balances? Are people using their vacation? We're starting to head into December, and if no one's using their vacation, I hope everyone doesn't leave and take the whole month of December off, because we might have some problems supporting the team. And then from an audit perspective, don't forget your administrators of OpenAir. Make sure you have things like your license overview. You're checking to see if users should be inactivated to free up licenses, cleaning up projects that haven't been used in a long time, because they're sort of one of those ad hoc consulting things, and after a year with no work, maybe they should be cleaned out, and open rejected timesheets to make sure people are getting back to them. So these are all names of reports, of course, but many of you have versions of these reports in your own instance, because these are the common reports that I see people asking for out of OpenAir. But maintenance becomes an issue, and a lot of these questions are probably what you've actually uttered. Maybe not John and Lisa, but maybe it's Joe and Sally. But the thing about the reports is, once you have people creating reports, it's very easy to create and forget that a report is useful or not useful, and creating multiple versions of reports. So some of the maintenance items that I recommend is, if you have a key set of reports, have all of those reports owned by a single account, and maybe even dedicate a user account. All of us have an OA admin account. You can use that. You can even inactivate that account if you want. It doesn't have to be owned by an active user, only until somebody needs to update them. So you as an administrator can proxy in as that report owner to update the report, so that you have that central control. So that's when you would have to activate it again. But that way you know which ones are the key ones, the core ones, and that's a good way to kind of have them stand out from a management perspective. An easy way to switch ownership of a report, there's a feature under the status tab in the reports module. Not administrators have access to this. So administrators, you can go into the status tab of the reports module, and you can actually change the report owner so that you can make sure that all the key ones are stored under that single report user. And another helpful hint is not only the naming convention, but also there's a notes field on every report form. Put a description of what that report is all about. That will help people understand, is it this report or that report that I'm supposed to run? Some of the names of reports are going to end up being very similar, and without putting 256 characters in the name of the report, use the notes field as that further breakdown, because you can actually use the advanced search feature on the page of the reports to find the right report based on a keyword, for example, and have it be able to, make sure you spell stuff right in the notes so that the keyword works. But the notes can be a good way that you're adding a description and giving a little bit of a high-level catalog online. Okay. And then the dreaded project dashboard. So I love project dashboards. I love the ease of being able to put reports on project dashboards, but sometimes people are inadvertently or accidentally putting reports on project dashboards. So things like you've got these unique client-specific or person-specific reports that suddenly show up on everyone's project dashboard. And the reason that happens is because John was editing this report, and he's looking at the name of the report that he's saving here, but he can't see, or maybe he doesn't notice that he's copying a report that's part of a project dashboard. So when he saves his own copy, that checkbox stays there unless he unchecks it. And in some cases, people don't have access to that because you want to control it. So he had inadvertently adds it to his to the project dashboard for everyone, and you want to avoid that because it junks it up, and you really want to keep that a clean report that only focuses on project-based information. So keep an eye on stuff like that. Make sure you just determine if you need to have people be able to control putting something on or off a dashboard themselves versus monitoring it as an administrator, because you'll want to keep that clean no matter what you do. Okay. And delete old reports. There's a good saying, old reports hide good reports, because the list just gets really, really long. So how do you make sure that you get the good reports other than keeping them stored with a single user? Identify when you could do a cleanup. If you can do it once a year, that's great. But basically, let people know, hey, if a report hasn't been run in the last 6 months, we're going to delete it. Or hey, if a report hasn't been shared or saved or created in the last 6 months, we're going to delete it. So just send a note out to everyone to say, hey, we're going to do a cleanup. They can make sure that they take action, and then they can, you as an administrator can go through and delete. Again, from the status tab, you can actually delete reports from here if you sort by last run or last save date in the system. And then another one, but I'm going to caution you on it, there's actually a feature in OpenAir back on global settings called maintenance settings, and one of the maintenance settings option is delete everything with an inactive user. So be careful if you want to do this. It's a nice quick way to delete stuff, but you should mean it, including if you used an inactive user as your key report owner, it will delete those too. You don't get an option to pick and choose. It's an all for nothing. So there's no undo on this. So I actually shy away from this. I don't want to delete stuff against inactive users. I want to mainly control it, but I'm a control freak, so that fits for me. Okay. So that brings us to the end. I had to you can see that was just sort of the tip of the iceberg on some of the design tips and use tips. So in a minute or two, I'm going to open up the lines for questions. But I want to leave you with, when you're designing a report, know that one report does not have to do everything. You will most likely have to set up different versions of a report for your audience, for your time frames, for the focus of who's going to use the report and why they're going to use it. A lot of people use the same core information, but they need that information sorted in different ways. And I would recommend, if you can, take the time to put a policy in place about when people should save reports, or what your cleanup policy is, and what controls you have in place on who can edit what and who can do what, because that'll go a long way to sort of stopping the growth of reports out of control, and then you're really not sure which ones are the ones you should be using on a day-to-day basis. So